This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a rainy Thanksgiving Eve in Portland, Oregon, a nondescript middle-aged man approached the Northwest Orient Airlines ticket counter at Portland International Airport. He paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket on the 2:50 p.m. Northwest Flight 305 bound for Seattle. On the ticket voucher, written in neat block letters, the man gave the name Dan Cooper. Before boarding, he double-checked with the gate agent that Flight 305 was indeed a Boeing 727-100, an important detail that would only become significant much later. Dan Cooper blended in easily with the holiday travel crowd. He was described as a white male in his mid-40s, around 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall with dark hair and brown eyes. He wore the conventional business attire of the day, a dark suit, described in some accounts as russet brown, a starched white shirt, and a slim black tie accented by a mother-of-pearl tie pin. Completing his look, Cooper carried a black briefcase and an ordinary brown paper bag. As he walked across the tarmac and up the boarding stairs to the awaiting Boeing 727, the man showed little that was memorable, except perhaps the fact that despite the cloudy autumn afternoon, he sported a pair of dark horn-rimmed sunglasses. Flight 305 was a short hop north to Seattle, about 30 minutes in the air. The flight was only about one-third full. 37 passengers in total were on board, including Cooper himself. The crew of 6 consisted of Captain William A. Scott, First Officer Bill Ratasak, Flight Engineer Harold E. Anderson, and 3 flight attendants. Senior stewardess Alice Hancock and 2 younger attendants, Florence or Flo Schaffner, age 23, and Tina Mucklow, age 22. Cooper took a seat in the last row of the coach cabin, seat 18E, at the rear of the plane, near the aft stairwell of the 727. He slipped into his aisle seat, settled back, and lit a cigarette. In 1971, airline travel still allowed smoking. Passengers nearby noticed he smoked Raleigh filter-tipped cigarettes, an inexpensive off-brand, casually resting the cigarette in his left hand as he waited for takeoff. Before the plane pushed back from the gate, Cooper ordered a drink, a bourbon whiskey with soda, which he paid for in cash. By all accounts, he was quiet, polite, and unremarkable during the boarding process. Essentially invisible, one fellow passenger would later recall. Flight 305 lifted off on schedule at 2:50 p.m., climbing into the overcast skies as light rain fell over Portland. As the Boeing 727 leveled off, Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant assigned to the coach cabin, made her way down the aisle checking in on passengers. When she reached the lone man in the last row, he wordlessly handed her a folded paper note. Schaffner had no reason to think that this was anything unusual. Attractive young stewardesses frequently received slips of paper with phone numbers or flirtatious messages. Assuming this was more of the same, Florence pocketed the note without opening it, intending to read what she presumed was a proposition later. As she started to move on, the man in seat 18E leaned toward her. In a low, calm voice, he said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." In that instant, everything changed aboard Flight 305. Florence Schaffner paused, stunned. She slowly retrieved the note from her pocket and opened it with trembling hands. The printed message inside was short and chilling. It stated that the plane was being hijacked, that Cooper had a bomb in his briefcase, and it instructed her to sit beside him. Schaffner's heart pounded as she slid into the vacant seat next to this stranger, trying to keep her composure. In a shaky whisper, she managed to ask, "Are you kidding me?" But Dan Cooper was deadly serious, and he intended to make his demands known. The quiet man in the dark suit had just set in motion one of the most infamous mysteries of all time. This is the story of Dan Cooper, more commonly known as D.B. Cooper. In the tense moments after Florence Schaffner read the hijacker's note, the normal rhythm of Flight 305 gave way to anxious uncertainty. Despite the era's more relaxed airport security, such as no metal detectors being in use at the time, nothing about Dan Cooper had raised alarm during boarding. Other passengers recalled only a quiet man sitting alone in the back. He had taken off his raincoat and settled in like any other business traveler. Tina Mucklow, the other stewardess serving coach that day, would later describe Cooper's demeanor during the flight's first few minutes as remarkably ordinary. She would later recall, he was not nervous, he seemed rather nice, and he was not cruel or nasty. Indeed, as Florence Schaffner now sat next to him, she noticed that Dan Cooper appeared calm and mildly observant, not outwardly agitated in the slightest. The crew of Flight 305 was highly experienced. Captain William Scott, 51 years old, was a former World War II pilot with thousands of flight hours under his belt. First Officer Bill Radizak and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson were also seasoned aviators. In the cabin, Alice Hancock, the senior flight attendant, had been with the airline for years. By contrast, Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow were quite young, 23 and 22 years old respectively, but had handled their fair share of difficult passengers in the past. As I mentioned before, unwanted advances from businessmen were a common occupational hazard for attractive stewardesses in the early 1970s. They still are today. So, for that reason, Florence's initial reaction to Dan Cooper's note was shaped by this reality, assuming it was just another flirtatious message. It wasn't until Cooper murmured his urgent warning to her that she realized this was no casual pickup attempt. When she opened up the paper note he had handed her, Florence Schaffner's blood ran cold. The note was written neatly in all capital letters with a felt-tip pen. Although Cooper would later reclaim this note, one of many clever tactics he used to leave behind no evidence, Florence remembered its gist clearly, stating, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I want you to sit by me." It also included a terrifying ultimatum, that if the man's demands were not met, he was prepared to blow up the airplane. One later account summarized Dan Cooper's message as a demand for money and parachutes by 5 p.m., with the warning that everyone on board would die if the demands were not fulfilled. In that moment, Florence Schaffner knew she was dealing not with a flirt, but with a desperate man capable of mass murder. Struggling to appear composed, Florence Schaffner slid into the seat next to Dan Cooper as instructed. The other passengers were oblivious to the drama. Many were reading magazines or dozing off on the short hop to Seattle. One man, George Labissiniere, got up to use the lavatory at the rear, just steps away from Cooper, and noticed nothing amiss. The flight continued smoothly and on schedule, with no indication to those on board that anything was wrong. The seatbelt signs were off, and the 727 cruised above the cloudy Pacific Northwest landscape as it usually did. Sitting next to Cooper in row 18, Florence tried to control her breathing. In a steady but quiet voice, she asked to see the supposed bomb. Surprisingly, Cooper obliged. He popped open his briefcase just enough for her to glimpse its contents. Inside, she saw at least 8 red cylinders stacked neatly, sticks of dynamite or something resembling them, wired together with insulation-covered wires attached to a large battery. It looked every bit like an improvised explosive device. Florence swallowed hard as Cooper clicked the case shut again. There was no doubt now in her mind that this was a genuine hijacking. Cooper spoke calmly, in a low voice, as he began to spell out his demands. He told Florence exactly what he wanted, and directed her to write it down so it could be delivered to the cockpit crew. Florence fumbled for a pen and paper, taking dictation from the hijacker. His requirements were precise and audacious. He wanted $200,000 in cash, specifically in negotiable American currency, unmarked $20 bills, to be delivered when the plane landed in Seattle. He insisted that the cash be put in a knapsack for easy carrying. He also wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary back parachutes and 2 reserve front parachutes, as well as a fuel truck standing by at the Seattle airport, ready to refuel the aircraft upon arrival. He also demanded there be no tricks. Cooper warned that there should be no funny stuff or I'll do the job. In other words, if authorities attempted any subterfuge or delay, he was prepared to detonate the bomb. Florence jotted down the hijacker's demands word for word. Later retellings of the note would quote Cooper's chilling words almost verbatim. "I want $200,000 by 5 p.m. in cash. Put it in a knapsack. I want 2 back parachutes and 2 front parachutes. When we land, I want a fuel truck ready to refuel. "No funny stuff or I'll do the job." This was the only direct threat Cooper voiced during the entire incident, and it was explicit. Everyone's life on Flight 305 now hung in the balance of how this drama would be handled. Clutching the hijacker's note, Florence turned and looked into Cooper's eyes. They were hidden behind his dark sunglasses, giving him an impenetrable, cool demeanor. Satisfied that his instructions were clear, Cooper allowed Florence to stand up. Keeping her voice as normal as possible, she informed him she was going to deliver his demands to the captain. Cooper handed her the original ransom note, the one he had first given her, and quietly retrieved it back from her once she had read it. This ensured that no handwriting sample of his would remain in evidence. From this point on, all of his communications would be written by the flight attendants at his dictation. It was one of many subtle moves that indicated Cooper had carefully thought through how to leave minimal traces of himself. Trying to appear casual, Florence Schaffner walked up the aisle toward the cockpit. As far as the other passengers knew, she was just going to check on that minor mechanical issue the crew would later claim as an excuse for delay. Once in the front galley, Florence met Alice Hancock, the senior stewardess, and quietly informed her of the dire situation. Hancock's eyes widened in shock as Florence showed her the note with Cooper's demands. At 3:12 p.m., Florence and Alice entered the cockpit and closed the door behind them. Captain Scott and First Officer Radizak turned to see the ashen face of Florence Schaffner. Handing over the hijacker's note, Florence quickly but calmly relayed everything Dan Cooper had told her. There was a man in row 18 claiming to have a bomb. He demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes by 5 p.m. He wanted the plane refueled on arrival in SeaTac. He promised to blow up the aircraft if anyone interfered or if his demands were not met on time. Captain Scott absorbed this information and immediately took action. He instructed Florence to remain in the cockpit out of sight and make detailed notes of all events for later reference. Scott's rationale was that Schaffner had already interacted with the hijacker and was understandably shaken. Better to have her safely up front helping with documentation. Tina Mucklow, on the other hand, had not yet been involved. The captain decided Tina would be the crew's liaison back in the cabin. Scott picked up the interphone and quietly summoned Tina to the cockpit, careful not to alarm any of the passengers. When Tina arrived, he briefed her quickly on the situation, that there was a hijacker with a bomb seated in the last row, and she was to return to him and act as the intermediary, complying with his request and keeping him calm. Before sending Tina back out, Captain Scott radioed air traffic control with a coded message. At around 3:15 p.m., he informed Seattle-Tacoma Airport's tower that we have a hijacker on board, and relayed the demands exactly as Dan Cooper had given them. The air traffic controller, momentarily stunned, acknowledged the message. Within minutes, word of the hijacking was passed from Seattle Air Traffic Control to the Seattle Police and immediately to the local office of the FBI. Northwest Orient's president, Donald Nyrop, was also contacted. Nyrop, hearing that one of his airliners was being hijacked, did not hesitate. He authorized full compliance with the hijacker's demands and instructed that all Northwest employees should cooperate fully to save the lives of those on board. In 1971, U.S. Airlines had no firm policy on dealing with hijackers demanding a ransom, but the safety of passengers and crew was paramount. The airline would pay and worry about the money later. Back in the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was still deceptively routine. Flight 305 had leveled off at around 30,000 feet and was cruising toward Seattle. To buy time for the ransom and parachutes to be gathered on the ground, Captain Scott came on the public address system and lied to the passengers. He apologized that a minor technical difficulty would prevent them from landing immediately, and that they would circle the Puget Sound for a while until it was resolved. This announcement barely caused a stir. A few passengers sighed or looked at their watches, but most took it in stride, minor delays not being uncommon. The 727 began flying in a slow, lazy holding pattern above the Seattle area, effectively turning the airliner into a bargaining chip orbiting overhead while law enforcement scrambled on the ground. With Florence Schaffner remaining in the cockpit, Tina Mucklow now assumed the dangerous role of cabin liaison. Tina walked calmly back down the aisle and made her way to row 18, the aftmost row. She introduced herself to the hijacker and slid into the seat next to him that Florence had vacated just a few minutes prior. Despite the tension, 22-year-old Tina tried to smile and project an air of professional calm. Inside, her heart was pounding, but like Florence, Tina would later recall that Cooper's own demeanor helped steady her. He seemed completely in control and unnervingly calm given what he was doing. Over the next several minutes and what would become hours, Tina Mucklow became Dan Cooper's primary attendant and conversational partner, the only other person besides the hijacker himself who remained in the know about every turn of the drama unfolding on Flight 305. As Flight 305 banked gently in its holding pattern above Seattle, Tina Mucklow sat by the hijacker's side and served as his eyes and ears on the rest of the plane. The tension in row 18 was palpable, but outwardly Dan Cooper remained collected, even courteous. He had Tina close the window shade next to him, perhaps to prevent snipers from catching a glimpse of him during the landing in Seattle. He also made a point of instructing Tina to stay by his side at all times during the aerial wait, a clear indication that he considered her presence both as insurance and as a conduit for his orders. Tina, for her part, kept her composure and engaged Cooper in quiet conversation to keep him calm. Remarkably, the two talked in a low tone almost like casual seatmates. At one point, looking out the window at the ground below peeking through breaks in the clouds, Cooper remarked, "Looks like Tacoma down there," noting the city's lights as the plane circled overhead. It struck Tina that he seemed familiar with the local terrain of Washington state. Indeed, when she mentioned to him that the parachutes they had requested were being sourced from nearby McChord Air Force Base, Cooper nodded and noted that McChord was only a 20-minute drive from SeaTac. These comments gave the impression that their hijacker knew the Pacific Northwest pretty well. In an effort to build rapport or glean insight into the man's motives, Tina gently asked Cooper, "Why did you choose Northwest Airlines?" Cooper chuckled at the question. "It's not because I have a grudge against your airline," he replied. "It's just because I have a grudge." He did not elaborate further on whom or what his grudge was directed toward. When Tina pressed a bit, asking, "Do you have a grudge against someone in particular?" Cooper became momentarily more guarded. He told her the flight choice had simply suited his needs, and he declined to reveal any personal details about himself. Sensing that that line of inquiry was unwelcome, Tina shifted to more neutral small talk. She mentioned that she was originally from Pennsylvania but now based in Minneapolis, Northwest Airlines' hometown. Cooper responded that Minnesota was very nice country, seeming to make polite conversation himself. However, when Tina in turn asked where he was from, Cooper's demeanor hardened. He refused to answer and quickly changed the subject. Clearly, he was willing to make small talk, but anything that might identify him personally was off limits. As the minutes ticked by, Tina noticed some more details about Dan Cooper. He opened his briefcase again briefly, not to threaten her, but to casually retrieve a pack of cigarettes. Offering Tina a smoke, he pulled out a Raleigh filter tip and lit it up. Tina declined at first, mentioning that she was trying to quit smoking, but under the unusual stress of the moment, she accepted the cigarette that Dan Cooper offered and joined him for a smoke in the rear cabin. The hijacker and the flight attendant sat side by side, sharing a surreal cigarette break at 10,000 feet in the sky, as if they were just a couple of coworkers unwinding. Tina later reported that Cooper even asked if she was nervous. She admitted that she was, but his oddly gentle demeanor did put her a bit more at ease. Meanwhile, not everyone on Flight 305 was entirely oblivious to the extended delay. One passenger, later dubbed the Cowboy for the Western-style Stetson hat that he wore, grew restless and suspicious when the plane repeatedly looped around Puget Sound instead of descending. The man got up from his seat and made his way toward the rear of the plane, ostensibly to stretch his legs or use the bathroom. Spotting Tina near the back, with Cooper nearby, the Cowboy approached her. "What's going on?" he asked, noting the plane's continued circling. Tina, following the cover story she had been given, replied with a friendly smile that there was a minor mechanical issue and that they would land as soon as possible. The Cowboy wasn't entirely convinced and started peppering her with questions. According to passenger George Lebissiniere, who witnessed this interaction, Cooper initially watched with amusement as Tina tried to deflect the inquiring passenger. But as the man persisted, ignoring Cooper's presence, Cooper's patience waned. Finally, the hijacker spoke up with quiet authority, telling the other man to return to his seat. The passenger dubbed the Cowboy either did not hear Cooper or chose to ignore him, continuing to badger Tina for answers. Lebissiniere himself intervened at this point, gently tugging on the Cowboy's arm and suggesting they sit back down. He managed to escort the curious man back up the aisle before any further confrontation occurred. But Tina later recalled a slightly different version of events. In her memory, the passenger simply asked her for something to read because he was bored. So she fetched a magazine, a copy of The New Yorker, from a rack directly behind Dan Cooper's row, handed it to the passenger, and he returned to his seat without incident. When Tina sat back down next to Dan Cooper, he made a subtle remark under his breath. "If that is a sky marshal, I don't want any more of that." Tina quickly assured him that there were no sky marshals on board Flight 305. Indeed, while the newly formed U.S. Sky Marshal program had begun earlier that year, the chance of one being on any given flight was extremely low, and it was later confirmed that Flight 305 had none. Cooper's comments suggested that he was alert to any sign of undercover law enforcement, but the incident passed without further drama. The unidentified cowboy passenger was never interviewed by the FBI and faded into anonymity, having unwittingly shared a brief moment with the skyjacker mid-flight. For roughly 2 hours, Flight 305 remained aloft, circling the Seattle area. Down below, an emergency response was rapidly taking shape, but up in the plane, the situation stayed calm and strangely cordial. Tina Mucklow continued to attend to Dan Cooper's needs. He asked for another drink, and she brought him a second bourbon and soda, which he paid for, insisting on giving her a few bucks and even offering to tip her for her service, but she politely declined, citing company policy against accepting tips. At one point, in an apparent gesture of kindness or perhaps dark humor, Cooper opened up his wallet and tried to give Tina and the other flight attendants some cash as a gratuity, presumably from his own pocket, not the ransom money. All 3 women refused again, reminding him of the no tips policy. Cooper did not object. He shrugged and put the money away. The fact that the hijacker was concerned with polite etiquette even amid a life-or-death hostage situation later struck many as bizarre. Tina herself later joked that she had nervously quipped, "Mind if I get some of that money?" when the ransom finally arrived, trying to break the tension. Cooper had readily offered her a bundle of bills on the spot, only for Tina to immediately hand it back. Gallows humor to lighten the mood in a pressure cooker environment. Through these interactions, Dan Cooper showed no signs of panic. If anything, he appeared to be a man who had prepared for this moment. Tina Mucklow observed that he seemed familiar with the aircraft's interior and the nuances of its operation. For instance, he clearly knew about the 727's unique rear stairway. He'd chosen this model of plane presumably because of that feature, yet he initially thought he might need assistance operating it in flight. The ability to deploy the aft staircase mid-flight was not widely known to the public. It was a capability known mostly to Boeing engineers or perhaps military or CIA operatives. Cooper's request to Tina and the cockpit crew would soon make clear he had a detailed escape plan, even if some of its finer points, like exactly how to get the stairs down safely, had to be worked out on the fly. Meanwhile, down on the ground, law enforcement and airline officials were racing against the clock to fulfill Cooper's demands before the 5 p.m. deadline. The next phase of this saga was about to begin as Flight 305 prepared to land in Seattle. But first, a short break. The moment that Captain Scott relayed the hijacker's demands to Seattle-Tacoma Air Traffic Control, an emergency response kicked into high gear. By about 3:30 p.m., even as Flight 305 still circled overhead, a command center was forming on the ground. The FBI office in Seattle and the Seattle Police Department both mobilized after getting word that a bomb threat hijacking was in progress. FBI Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who would soon become the Bureau's point man on this case, headed to the airport. Northwest Orient's operations manager convened with law enforcement to figure out how to meet the hijacker's demands within the short time frame. Though skyjackings had become disturbingly frequent by 1971, there was no playbook for this exact scenario. Most were politically motivated, or involved diverting planes to Cuba. A demand for a huge cash ransom was unusual but not unheard of. Still, this combination of a bomb threat and a daredevil parachute escape was something new. Northwest President Donald Nyrop had already given the green light. Pay the ransom and do whatever was necessary to protect the lives of the passengers and crew. That meant obtaining $200,000 in cash on very short notice. The task fell to Seattle police and FBI agents to gather the money. They reached out to local banks, and it was Seattle First National Bank that stepped up to provide the funds. Agents requested the money in unmarked $20 bills, as specified by the hijacker himself. In an impressive feat of rapid logistics, the bank assembled 10,000 $20 notes, which were photographed onto microfilm to record each serial number. The serials mostly began with the letter L, indicating issuance by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, and were not sequential to make tracking harder. By late afternoon, agents had a large canvas bag filled with stacks of $20 bills totaling $200,000, weighing about 19 pounds. The demand for parachutes proved more challenging. Cooper had asked for 4 parachutes, 2 main back chutes and 2 reserve front chutes. This was likely a calculated move. With multiple parachutes requested, authorities had to assume he might take a hostage, perhaps a crew member or passenger. Thus, they could not risk sabotaging the chutes without endangering an innocent person. The FBI scrambled to source the parachutes on short notice. Seattle police reached out to a local skydiving school, Seattle Sky Sports, run by an experienced parachutist named Earl Cossey. Cossey provided 2 civilian sports parachutes, which were the front reserve chutes, from his collection. For the 2 main back parachutes, authorities turned to a local stunt pilot and skydiver, Norman Hayden, who lent 2 military-style BA-22 parachute rigs, the backpack types used for skydiving. By coincidence, one of the reserve chutes obtained from Cossey was a dummy training chute, an inert rig sewn shut for classroom use, with no functioning parachute inside. Whether the FBI delivered this non-functional reserve intentionally or by mistake remains a matter of debate. Regardless, Cooper would later end up taking that dummy reserve with him, perhaps unknowingly when he jumped. But at the time, agents simply grabbed whatever parachutes they could find in their rush. By 5:24 p.m., 24 minutes after the deadline, word came that the demands were ready to be met, that the cash and parachutes had arrived at SeaTac Airport. Captain Scott, still circling in the sky, received the message and informed Cooper that they would be landing shortly now that his ransom and equipment were on site. Cooper instructed Scott to land only when everything was set, and to do so on a remote, well-lit portion of the tarmac away from the main terminal. He also specified that on landing, only one person should approach the plane to deliver the goods, using the front boarding stairs via a mobile staircase vehicle, presumably to minimize the chance of a stealth attack amid a crowd. The authorities agreed to these terms. At 5:45 p.m., Flight 305 finally touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, well after nightfall on this late November evening. Cooper had kept his cool during the approach. Through Tina, he reiterated that he wanted the cabin lights dimmed and the window shades closed to avoid sniper sights. With the bomb still allegedly at his side, everyone proceeded with extreme caution. Following Cooper's directive, Captain Scott taxied the Boeing 727 to an isolated stretch of runway, far from the terminals and emergency vehicles that were standing by. There, the plane came to a stop. On the ground, a mobile staircase was driven up to the 727's forward door. As agreed, only a single individual approached, Al Lee, Northwest Seattle operations manager, who volunteered to be the courier. To avoid any misinterpretation, Lee changed out of his airline uniform and into plainclothes. Cooper had warned that no one in police or military uniform should come near the plane, and an airline uniform might conceivably be mistaken for law enforcement in the dark. Carrying the heavy canvas sack of money and the 4 parachute packs, and under careful watch of FBI snipers from a distance, Al Lee walked across the tarmac alone toward the parked 727. According to the plan, Tina Mucklow opened the forward cabin door and stepped out to receive the delivery. It was raining lightly at SeaTac as Tina, under Cooper's watchful eye from the open doorway, met Al Lee at the top of the mobile stairs. Lee handed over the bag of cash first, then each of the parachute packs. Tina, struggling slightly under the weight, carried the large sack past rows of wide-eyed passengers still seated in the cabin, all the way to the rear where Cooper waited. She also brought the parachutes back 2 at a time. Once Cooper was satisfied that his demands had been met in full, the money bag and 4 parachutes now in his possession, he agreed to let the remaining passengers leave the plane. Tina Mucklow then made an announcement over the PA for the passengers. "You're free to deplane now. Please remain calm and leave all your belongings." The weary travelers were confused but relieved. They had been told up to now only that a mechanical issue caused the delay. Many still had no idea that a hijacking had ever occurred. Nonetheless, row by row, 36 astonished passengers shuffled toward the front door and down the mobile stairway into the cool night air, greeted by a legion of police who whisked them away to safety. It was at this point that Tina tried to inject a bit of levity. With a faint smile, she asked the hijacker, "Mind if I have some of this money?" as she passed by with the ransom sack. As I mentioned earlier, Cooper actually offered her a packet of bills with no hesitation, essentially a tip for her help. But Tina immediately declined and handed it back, explaining that accepting gratuities was against company policy. Cooper nodded. He had also earlier tried to tip Florence and Alice with his own pocket money and had been refused. The absurd politeness of the gesture was not lost on Tina, but it was a brief human moment in an otherwise high-stakes exchange. With the passengers safely off the plane, only the hijacker and 4 crew members remained. There was Captain Scott, First Officer Radizak, Flight Engineer Anderson, and Tina Mucklow, who was in the cabin with Cooper. The other 3 remained in the cockpit. Flight attendants Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock had used the opportunity to retrieve their own belongings, and then they quickly deplaned as well. Florence Schaffner had actually asked for Cooper's permission to grab her purse from a compartment near his seat, and he quipped, "I won't bite you," as she gingerly reached past him. Before Alice and Florence left, one of them asked Cooper if the 3 flight attendants could exit the aircraft along with the passengers. Cooper unexpectedly responded with gallant indifference. "Whatever you girls would like," he said. However, Cooper stipulated that Tina Mucklow must stay aboard to assist him for the next phase. Tina, knowing at least now that all of the passengers and her colleagues were safe, steeled herself to remain as the sole hostage. Outside, the situation remained tense. Refueling the Boeing 727 proved troublesome. The airport had sent a tanker truck to top off Flight 305's fuel tanks as Cooper demanded, but the pump mechanism malfunctioned, causing some delays. Cooper, peering out a window, grew agitated that the refueling was taking longer than expected. 2 more fuel trucks were brought in quick succession to complete the job. While they waited, Cooper discovered one issue with his ransom. The money had been delivered in a cloth canvas sack, essentially a bank money bag, rather than a waterproof knapsack as he had specified. This clearly annoyed him. As he grumbled to Tina, "This isn't what I asked for." Now he would have to improvise a way to securely carry the money for his jump. Without missing a beat, Cooper pulled out a pocket knife. He took one of the reserve parachute packs, not intended for use, but likely brought as a decoy or backup, and swiftly slashed it open. He dumped out its contents, cutting away the silk canopy, and began repurposing the pack into a makeshift money bag. Using the parachute's strong shroud lines, he fashioned a crude handle or carrying strap for the canvas sack. Tina watched as Cooper coolly converted the gear to his needs, stuffing bundles of cash into the empty parachute bag to reinforce the less sturdy bank bag. It was evident that he had expected a knapsack and was ready to adapt to this hiccup. Unknown to either Tina or Cooper, the reserve chute he cannibalized was possibly the non-functional dummy chute. In effect, he cleverly put it to the only real use it had, as parts for his money carrier. The refueling delay stretched on, reaching about 6 p.m. and beyond. Cooper's patience, largely intact until now, began to fray ever so slightly. In an uncharacteristic flash of irritation, he remarked to Tina, "It shouldn't take this long." He then picked up the cabin phone connecting to the cockpit and directly addressed Captain Scott. "Let's get the show on the road," he ordered curtly over the intercom. Scott explained through the closed cockpit door that the fueling would be finished in moments. True to his word, by approximately 7:40 p.m., the 727's tanks were finally topped off for the long flight that Cooper was about to command. While still on the ground in Seattle, Cooper outlined his flight plan to the cockpit crew via Tina and occasional use of the interphone. His instructions were highly specific. The aircraft was to fly southeast toward Mexico City at the minimum airspeed possible without stalling, roughly 100 knots or 115 miles per hour, and at a low altitude no higher than 10,000 feet. Furthermore, the landing gear was to remain down, and the wing flaps set at 15 degrees. Crucially, Cooper said he wanted the cabin to remain unpressurized during flight. These conditions, he presumably already knew, would allow the aft stair door to be opened in flight without a catastrophic depressurization. The combination of gear down, flaps 15, and low speed also made for a nose-high, very fuel-inefficient ride, one that greatly limited the plane's range. Indeed, First Officer Radizak informed Cooper that at such settings, they couldn't reach Mexico City without a refuel stop. The 727 would only have about a 1,000-mile range in that configuration, meaning that at least one stop would be needed north of the Mexican border. The crew suggested some options for refueling along the way. They proposed Reno, Nevada as a likely stop, and possibly Yuma, Arizona after that if needed. Cooper agreed to a refueling stop in Reno, a city on the general route south, but he did not comment on Yuma specifically. The priority for him was simply to get airborne again and out of US airspace as quickly as possible. Cooper had one more bold demand. He wanted to take off with the aft stairway in the down position. This was an unprecedented request. No commercial jet had ever taken off with its rear ventral stairs deployed. Captain Scott responded that takeoff with the stairs down was unsafe and impossible, but he offered to check with engineers. Through some radio relays, Northwest operations team consulted Boeing engineers, who confirmed that while the 727 likely could not physically lift off with the ventral stair deployed, it was technically possible to lower the stair in flight without causing an accident. This information was then relayed back to Cooper. Satisfied with that, he let the issue go, telling Scott that he would lower the stairs himself after takeoff, and he did not insist on trying to depart with them already down. With all preparations complete, the moment came to launch Phase 2 of Dan Cooper's plan. At 7:36 p.m., Northwest Flight 305 was cleared for takeoff from SeaTac. The runway lights glowed as the 727's engine spooled up. In the cabin, Tina sat in a jump seat near Cooper for takeoff, per his instructions that she remain with him. Unbeknownst to Cooper, two F-106 fighter jets from McChord Air Force Base had quietly scrambled during the Seattle pit stop and were now aloft to shadow the 727. They, along with a smaller T-33 jet trainer, were attempting to follow Flight 305 at a distance, out of Cooper's view. But because the airliner was flying so slowly and low, the military jets had to perform wide S-shaped maneuvers to avoid overtaking it, and the T-33 could not descend low enough to track it directly. The stage was set for the final act of Dan Cooper's audacious crime. Northwest 305 thundered down the runway and lifted off into the night sky, heading south by southeast on Airway Victor 23 toward the Oregon state line. Rain was falling and a cloud-covered quarter moon provided little illumination over the dark Pacific Northwest forest below. Inside the plane, soon after reaching the assigned altitude of 10,000 feet, Cooper turned to Tina. It was time. "Lower the aft stairs now," he instructed her. Tina hesitated, imagining the sudden whoosh of air and the possibility of being sucked out of the plane. In the cockpit, the crew heard her reluctance and offered a suggestion. She could come forward and retrieve a length of emergency rope to tether herself while operating the stairs. But Cooper immediately rejected that idea. He was adamant that the cockpit crew stay up front and Tina not leave his sight or go forward. Tina continued to protest that she was afraid of being pulled out of the plane by the airstream if the door was opened at altitude. The hijacker, showing a degree of understanding, relented on making her do it. He told Tina he would open the stairs himself. She pleaded once more, asking if he could at least cut a cord from one of the parachutes to fashion a safety line for her. Cooper responded with a simple, "No, never mind," and decided he did not need her assistance after all. He directed Tina to go back to the cockpit and close the curtain partition between first class and coach behind her. Realizing this might be her last exchange with the mysterious hijacker, Tina summoned her courage to make one personal plea. As she got up to head forward, she turned to Cooper and said, please take the bomb with you." If he was going to jump, she begged that he not leave the live explosive behind to potentially kill them all. Cooper gave her an ambiguous reassurance. He said he would either disarm the bomb or take it with him when he jumped. It wasn't a promise exactly, but it was enough for Tina in that moment. Tina Mucklow moved up the aisle toward the cockpit. As she did, she stole a final glance over her shoulder at the hijacker. Dan Cooper had risen from his seat. In the rear of the empty coach cabin, Tina saw him standing in the aisle, tying the brim of the money bag around his waist with what looked like parachute cords. He was preparing for his jump. Tina could hardly believe the sight. The man was about to leap into a thunderstorm at night, carrying $200,000 in cash. She took a breath, then closed the heavy vinyl curtain that separated first class from the coach section, as Cooper had instructed. Then she continued on and slipped into the cockpit with the pilots, locking the door behind her. It was approximately 8 p.m. when Tina joined the others and briefed them that Cooper was gearing up to jump. For a few minutes, there was silence from the back of the plane. The crew in the cockpit kept monitoring their instruments. At about 8:05 p.m., a warning light flashed on the pilot's panel, indicating that the aft air stair had been deployed in mid-flight. Captain Scott used the intercom to shout back, asking, "Is everything okay back there? Need any help?" The reply that crackled through was a single word from Cooper: "No." It would be his last known communication. At roughly 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section suddenly yawed upward, a sharp movement that caught the pilot's attention immediately. The 727's nose dipped and the crew had to trim the plane to keep it level. This sudden change in pitch was consistent with the weight and aerodynamic shift that would occur if the aft stairway was lowered and someone jumped off. First Officer Radizak would later tell investigators that this bump occurred as they were passing near the suburbs north of Portland, indicating that Cooper might have leapt over southwestern Washington, not far from the Lewis River. Unsure whether the hijacker was still on board or not, the pilots remained in the cockpit as instructed. They knew that the aft stair was open, which meant that the plane was effectively flying with a big door hanging down. As they neared the next planned stop, Reno, Nevada, at around 10 p.m., Captain Scott got on the intercom and tried to raise Cooper again. Tina Mucklow also used the PA system to inform Cooper that they were approaching Reno and needed him to raise the stairs for landing, otherwise it would be unsafe. They got no response. Tina repeated her request a few times as Reno's lights came into view, but still no reply from the man in the back of the plane. The plane had been flying for over an hour and a half since Seattle, and for most of that time the crew had heard nothing but radio chatter and the rush of wind from the partially open aft door. At 11:02 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Reno Tahoe International Airport with the rear stairway still extended beneath its tail. Captain Scott brought the jet to a stop on an isolated apron, and the pilots and Tina waited. Unsure if the hijacker and his possibly live bomb were still on board, FBI agents and police who had gathered in Reno held their distance, guns drawn, forming a perimeter around the plane with floodlights. After a few minutes, with no signs from the cabin, Captain Scott decided to leave the cockpit cautiously. He emerged into the cabin, pistol in hand. By this point, someone had provided the crew with a firearm for self-defense, and made his way aft. The rear door gaped open to the night. The aft stairs were fully down, but there was no sign of Dan Cooper. He was gone. All that remained in the back of the plane were two of the parachute rigs, one of the main parachutes and one reserve, one of which had been slashed open, and the thin black clip-on tie that Cooper had removed and left draped over a seat, complete with a mother-of-pearl tie clip. There were also 8 cigarette butts in an ashtray and a few stray hairs on the seat headrest, but of the hijacker and the ransom money, there wasn't a trace. After about half an hour of cautiously sweeping the aircraft, a Reno police bomb squad declared the plane clear. There was no bomb left behind. Cooper had apparently taken or disarmed it as promised. The legendary skyjacker had escaped into the night without a scratch to anyone on board. The FBI and law enforcement personnel on the ground were left staring at an empty 727 and into the starless sky beyond, asking themselves the same question that the rest of the world would soon be asking. Where did Dan Cooper go? Within hours of the daring leap from Flight 305, one of the most intensive manhunts in American history had begun. The FBI, which had led the negotiations in Seattle under the case name Norjack for Northwest Hijacking, now shifted fully into search and recovery mode. Agents quickly secured the hijacked aircraft in Reno, dusting for fingerprints and collecting any physical evidence. Technicians recovered 66 latent fingerprints from various parts of the cabin, though matching them to the suspect proved difficult without a known identity. They bagged Cooper's black JCPenney clip-on tie and tie clip left on the seat. They also gathered the 2 parachutes he had left behind, one unused reserve with the cords cut, and one of the primary backpacks which was still intact. Curiously, all 8 Raleigh cigarette butts that Cooper had extinguished were also retrieved from an ashtray in his row. Decades later, the FBI would discover that those cigarette butts were inadvertently lost or destroyed before DNA testing became available, a frustrating lapse since they might have contained the hijacker's genetic fingerprint. Even as evidence was being collected in Reno, the FBI's focus turned to the vast, rugged landscape that Cooper had likely parachuted into. Based on the flight path and the timing of the 8:13 p.m. bump when the plane's tail rose suddenly, initial estimates placed the probable drop zone in the dense woods near the Lewis River in southwestern Washington, specifically near Lake Merwin, not far from Ariel, Washington. This area is about 30 miles north of Portland and directly under the flight's known route. FBI agents coordinated with local law enforcement, state troopers, and even U.S. Air Force personnel to organize a search of this region. The U.S. Air Force had, incredibly, dispatched a top-secret SR-71 Blackbird spy plane to make several high-altitude passes over the flight path, trying to photograph any sign of Cooper or parachutes on the ground. However, the darkness, the thick cloud cover, and the dense forest canopy thwarted many of those aerial photography attempts. At dawn on November 25th, Thanksgiving Day, ground search teams mobilized in force. Helicopters from nearby Fort Lewis buzzed low over the suspected drop zone, scanning for disturbed treetops, parachute fabric, or any sign of a camp or body. On foot, FBI agents and about 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis and local volunteers combed through miles of forest, slogging over rough terrain and fanning out in grid patterns. It was a daunting task. The search area encompassed dense woods, rivers, and steep hills in the southern Cascades. The November weather was wet and cold, turning the ground to mud and limiting visibility under the evergreen canopy. Despite days of efforts, not a single trace of Dan Cooper, his parachute, or the ransom money was immediately found. The search wasn't confined to Washington either. In case the drop zone calculation was off, authorities also quietly checked parts of Oregon just south of the Columbia River. One off-duty sheriff's deputy in northeastern Oregon even reported hearing a mysterious suspected hijacker transmission on his ham radio the night of the jump, though this lead later fizzled out. Local residents in southwestern Washington were questioned and told to report anything unusual, such as a hurt stranger appearing at their door, unexplained vehicles, parachutes, etc. Door-to-door inquiries in farmhouses and towns near the Lewis River were conducted. Some civilians eagerly joined the search. In one famous instance, a local well-to-do adventurer conjectured that Cooper might have landed in Lake Merwin itself, so he hired a submarine to search the lake bottom for the ransom or the body. As you can imagine, nothing was found. Back in the offices of the FBI, agents feverishly worked another angle, finding possible suspects on the ground. The hijacker had given the name Dan Cooper, but everyone realized this was likely an alias. In Portland, they actually located and interviewed a man named D.B. Cooper, a minor local ex-con, but it was quickly confirmed that he had no connection. Not only did he have an alibi, but he looked nothing like the suspect. The only legacy of that mistaken identity was a media mix-up. A reporter overheard police radio chatter about a D.B. Cooper and assumed it was the hijacker's name. In rushing to meet a deadline, James Long of the Oregon Journal accidentally wrote D.B. Cooper instead of Dan Cooper in a news story. The UPI wire service picked up the erroneous name and broadcast it nationwide. By the time the mistake was recognized, it was too late. D.B. Cooper had entered the lore as the hijacker's moniker, and it ultimately stuck. FBI agents later clarified that the hijacker never used the initials D.B. at all. That was purely a press invention. But the catchy, alliterative name had captured public imagination in a way that Dan Cooper likely never would have. The media coverage of the skyjacking was frenzied. On November 25, 1971, the day after this incident, Americans woke up to some startling headlines. An airliner had been hijacked in the Pacific Northwest, and there was a daring parachute escape with a huge ransom, as well as an unknown suspect on the loose. The fact that the hijacker had seemingly vanished into thin air gave the story a sensational, almost mythic quality from the start. Journalists descended on Seattle, Portland, and Reno to get interviews with the Flight 305 crew and passengers. Northwest Orion's president, Donald Nyrop, gave statements reassuring that everything possible was done to ensure passenger safety. And indeed, all the passengers were safe, if a little befuddled. The flight crew, once debriefed, were hailed as heroes for their calm handling of the crisis. Dramatic images hit the newswires. FBI agents standing by piles of cash or holding up the composite sketch of D.B. Cooper that was already in progress. At SeaTac, FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach briefed reporters, describing the suspect as a man in his mid-40s, olive complexion, wearing a dark suit and tie, emphasizing how extraordinary the case was. Himmelsbach in particular became a media fixture. Though not actually the case's lead FBI agent at first, he was the most vocal and, by his own admission, obsessed with catching D.B. Cooper. A pilot himself, Himmelsbach had ironically been up in a helicopter the night of the hijacking attempting to follow Flight 305, but the chopper could not keep up. In press conferences, Himmelsbach did not hide his personal opinion. He believed that the hijacker was probably dead. Given the inclement weather, the nighttime jump, and the difficult terrain, Himmelsbach speculated that Dan Cooper had likely not survived the parachute descent, saying that he probably hadn't even gotten his chute open before hitting the ground. He colorfully described the terrain as unforgiving, imagining Cooper's body buried in thick mud or lost at the bottom of some ravine. Over the next few weeks, Himmelsbach's certainty about Cooper's fate, that he was dead in the wilderness somewhere, would set the tone for the FBI's public stance. As 1971 drew to a close, the immediate frenzy slowly gave way to some frustration. Despite an intense search through late November and into December, nothing conclusive was found in the forest of the Pacific Northwest. On December 6, 1971, after nearly 2 weeks of fruitless searching, the FBI scaled back the ground hunt. The official investigation was still very much open, but they had to admit they lacked hard evidence of where Dan Cooper landed. The 727's flight parameters, its speed, its altitude, and weather variables had too much uncertainty to pinpoint an exact drop zone. The fighter jet pilots had seen nothing. Their radar picked up no parachute. With a moonless, stormy sky, a man dressed in dark clothes would have been all but invisible during the jump. The FBI's best guess remained somewhere near the Lewis River in southwest Washington, but even that covered a huge swath of wilderness. Investigators did find some shreds of potential evidence in subsequent months, though each would only lead to more questions. In early 1972, a hunter deep in the woods found a small placard printed with instructions for lowering a Boeing 727's aft stairs, exactly the kind found by the rear door of a 727. This placard was later confirmed to have come from the hijacked plane, likely ripped off by the air stair turbulence. It was discovered along the flight path north of the Columbia River, further substantiating the basic area where Cooper was believed to have jumped. However, it offered no new clues beyond what was already assumed, and no other gear was found with it. The public, for its part, was enthralled by the story of Dan or D.B. Cooper. In the Pacific Northwest especially, Cooper became a bit of a folk hero almost overnight. Some people saw him as a daring outlaw folk hero, the man who beat the odds and perhaps got away with it. Older children in Washington traded exaggerated tales on playgrounds about Dan Cooper hiding out in the woods or living incognito in some small town. Nationally, the Cooper saga tapped into a 1970s zeitgeist of distrust of authority and an admiration for rebels. Here was a criminal who, at least on the surface, hurt no one except faceless corporations and the government. In an era of skyjackings often tied to political terror, Cooper's caper seemed almost refreshing in its cinematic audacity and lack of violence. Within days, however, the FBI reminded the public that this was no joke, that an armed man extorted $200,000 and risked the lives of dozens. They appealed to citizens for any tips that could lead to his identity. A hotline was flooded with calls, psychics claiming visions, pranksters spinning yarns, and a few seemingly credible tips about odd individuals who suddenly had money or parachute experience. The FBI methodically followed up on leads. They interrogated former paratroopers, recently released convicts, known thrill seekers, anyone who even remotely matched the physical description and the circumstances of the case. As Christmas 1971 approached, the hijacking case that started in a burst of drama had entered the slog of a long, uncertain investigation. We're going to pause once more for another quick break. In the months and years immediately following the D.B. Cooper skyjacking, the FBI's Norjack investigation carried on, but progress was hard to come by. Initially, suspects were plentiful. The Bureau would later reveal that between 1971 and 2016 it considered over 1,000 serious suspects in the Cooper case, not to mention countless less plausible leads. In the early 1970s, agents chased tip after tip. Many were inevitably false confessions. In fact, scores of prison inmates claimed to be Dan Cooper, hoping that the federal charges or even just a temporary move to a nicer federal facility might improve their lot in life. These were easily debunked by fingerprints or alibis. Other leads came from family members who harbored suspicions about a brother, a husband, and uncle who matched the description and had exhibited strange behavior after Thanksgiving 1971. Each was checked out systematically. One of the earliest strong suspects emerged in April of 1972, just months after the case, and he came with an eerily similar crime. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a 29-year-old former Army Green Beret and Vietnam veteran, carried out a copycat hijacking just 5 months after Cooper's. On April 7, 1972, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines 727 on a flight from Denver to San Francisco, demanded $500,000 cash, and parachuted out over Utah with the money. Unlike Cooper, though, McCoy was caught within days. Authorities arrested him with $499,970 of the ransom in his possession. McCoy's exploit immediately raised eyebrows in the FBI. Could this be the same man as D.B. Cooper, pulling a heist again? McCoy did bear a resemblance to the Cooper composite sketch and was an expert skydiver with Army jump training. The Bureau initially believed that they might have cracked the Cooper case and reportedly even charged McCoy with the Cooper hijacking for a time. McCoy, however, was in his hometown in Utah on Thanksgiving. Photographic evidence and family testimony confirmed this alibi. Moreover, at 29 years old, he was much younger than witnesses' estimates of Dan Cooper's age, who put him in his mid-40s. After McCoy's arrest, an FBI agent was quoted saying that he thought McCoy was Cooper, but officially the Bureau eventually classified McCoy as an unrelated copycat. McCoy was convicted of his own hijacking and given a 45-year sentence. He famously escaped prison in 1974 using a fake gun made of plaster and commandeering a garbage truck, and was killed in a shootout with FBI agents shortly thereafter. To this day, a fringe of Cooper investigators believe that Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was the man himself, but the FBI stands by the conclusion that differences in age, appearance, and modus operandi rule him out. Aside from McCoy, though, the 1970s saw many other suspects rise and fall in the Dan Cooper case. Some were serious candidates, others verged on the bizarre. In late 1971, some speculated that the hijacker might have been John List, an infamous New Jersey man who just weeks before the Cooper hijacking had murdered his entire family and then disappeared. List was of a similar age and build, wore glasses, and vanished with a need for cash. The FBI did a cursory check, but List, who was a fugitive until 1989 when he was caught living under an alias, was later ruled out definitively. He had no skydiving background and his personality did not fit Cooper's profile. This theory mostly lived on in amateur sleuth circles and faded once List was captured and his story known. By 1973, the FBI's working theory, heavily influenced by Himmelsbach, was that Dan Cooper likely died in the jump. In summer 1973, FBI and local teams staged experimental recreations of the jump, pushing weighted dummies out of the same aft stairs of a 727 in flight to narrow down the landing zone. They analyzed wind speeds, parachute drift, and concluded an area near the southern flank of Mount St. Helens might have been the landing zone. Yet intensive searches there also yielded nothing. The natural environment seemed to have swallowed Dan Cooper without a trace. The legacy of Cooper in the 1970s wasn't just an investigative concern. It led directly to changes in aviation security. By early 1972, the FAA mandated that all Boeing 727s be retrofitted with a simple device called the Cooper vane, a mechanical latch that prevents the rear stairway from being lowered in flight. In addition, the unprecedented success of Cooper's ransom extortion contributed to the push for strict airport security screenings. By 1973, the FAA required that all passengers and bags be screened by metal detectors and X-ray machines before boarding. The era of easily carrying guns or bombs onto planes was ending, largely in response to the wave of skyjackings that climaxed with Cooper's escapade. These measures soon dramatically reduced the frequency for hijackings for ransom. In that sense, Cooper's lasting legacy was inadvertently making US skies safer, or at least forcing the government to make them safer. But throughout the mid to late 1970s, the Dan Cooper case slowly turned cold. Leads began to dwindle. Agents in field offices would occasionally get a tip. A man in Oregon bragged at a bar about being the skyjacker. A woman in California reported that her ex-husband had a green parachute and extra cash after 1971. An incarcerated felon claimed that his cellmate confessed to being Dan Cooper. The FBI chased all of these leads, often publicly dismissing them but quietly checking backgrounds and fingerprints. All came up empty. Behind the scenes, profilers tried to sketch Cooper's psychological portrait. The FBI believed that Cooper was likely familiar with both aviation and the Pacific Northwest. His calmness suggested military or at least aviation experience. The use of the name Dan Cooper, which happened to be the name of a French-language comic book hero, a Canadian Air Force pilot in a popular Belgian comic series, was a tantalizing clue. Could our hijacker have chosen that alias from a comic he read during childhood or while stationed overseas? It pointed to perhaps a Canadian connection, or someone who had been in Europe. But that clue, like so many others, led nowhere concrete. By 1977 and 1978, the active Norjack task force had been massively reduced. Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, still publicly adamant that Dan Cooper died, retired from the FBI in 1980 and even authored a book about the case called Norjack in 1986. In that book and in subsequent interviews, Himmelsbach reiterated his belief that Cooper's get-rich-quick stunt had ended in fatal failure out in the woods. He noted that none of the ransom money had ever shown up in circulation, not a single bill, which to him was evidence that the money, and by implication Cooper's body, was out there decaying somewhere in the elements. However, one early retired FBI agent's opinion did not close the case. In fact, the Cooper investigation was about to get a jumpstart from an unexpected discovery at the dawn of the new decade, one that would electrify the public and force the FBI to rethink some of its assumptions. On Sunday, February 10th, 1980, over 8 years after Dan Cooper vanished, an astonishing discovery was made on the banks of the Columbia River. That afternoon, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was playing on a sandy stretch of riverbank known as Tina Bar, about 9 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. Brian's family was picnicking on the Columbia's shoreline, and the boy had begun digging in the sand to build a campfire pit. As he scraped and raked the sand, Brian uncovered a tattered bundle of waterlogged $20 bills. Surprised, he dug further and found 2 more bundles. In total, 3 clumped packets of currency were unearthed from the riverbank. The Ingrams immediately recognized the potential significance. Just about everyone in Washington and Oregon knew the legend of D.B. Cooper's missing ransom money. Brian's father carefully collected the disintegrating bills and turned them over to the FBI. In all, the bundles contained roughly $5,800 in $20 notes, 290 individual bills, though many were fragmentary. Crucially, when an FBI agent on the phone asked Mr. Ingram to read some serial numbers off the bills, they matched the ransom money from the Cooper hijacking. It was the first physical evidence related to the case that had been found in nearly a decade. The bills were still bound with rubber bands and arranged in 2 complete packets of 100 each, and a partial packet of 90, exactly as they had been when given to Dan Cooper. The FBI lab confirmed these notes were indeed part of the ransom. The serial numbers corresponded to the list of $10,000 20s that had been prepared in Seattle back in 1971. The discovery at Tina Bar set off a new wave of excitement and speculation. How did $5,800 of Cooper's money end up buried in the sand along the Columbia River, some 20 miles from the suspected drop zone near Ariel, and on the opposite side of the Columbia from where most of the search had focused? The location was downstream of Vancouver and not directly connected to the Lewis River, which empties into the Columbia farther downstream. This perplexing find raised many questions and a few answers. FBI agents and scientists examined the condition of the bills for clues. The bundles were in pretty rough shape. The outer bills were heavily decayed, and all the notes had fused together in clumps. Yet some details were telling. The rubber bands binding them were intact, though brittle. If the money had been continuously exposed to the elements since 1971, the bands likely would have disintegrated far sooner. Sediment analysis suggested that the bills had been submerged and then deposited in the sand by water action. A consulting hydrologist noted that the edges of the bundles were rounded, and the bills matted together, indicating that they were moved by river currents rather than buried intentionally by hand. It was believed that the money probably washed into the Columbia from one of its tributaries, like the Lewis River, and then became lodged in that sandbar by natural forces. However, this hypothesis introduced some contradictions. If the money came from the Lewis River upstream, where Cooper presumably landed, how did these separate bundles remain together? Why were 10 bills missing from one packet, with there being 90 instead of 100? And if they floated freely, why weren't the rubber bands long gone? One theory posited by geologists was that the bundles might have been buried in sediments upstream and then dredged up by the Portland area dredging projects in 1974, with the dredge sand later deposited at Tina Bar. Another theory suggested a 1977 flood of the Columbia could have uprooted a buried cache and redeposited it there. The FBI tested sand from the bundles and consulted experts on diatoms, microscopic algae, to estimate when the money might have been in the water. This analysis later indicated that the money had entered the water at least several months after the late November hijacking, possibly in spring or summer when certain algae blooms occurred. This was consistent with the dredge or flood theories. For all of these scientific conjecture, one troubling possibility remained. The Tina Bar money find might imply that Dan Cooper or someone planted the money there deliberately years after the hijacking, as a decoy or in an attempt to recover it later. If Cooper had survived the jump but lost or buried some of the loot, perhaps he disposed of it along the river at a later date. Agents considered, for instance, whether Cooper could have landed safely, then traveled or had an accomplice bury some money on the riverbank to mislead investigators. But even then, that seemed like a bit of an odd move. Why would you sacrifice $5,800 of hard-won cash? After negotiations, young Brian Ingram was allowed to keep a portion of the found money as a reward. In 1986, after the FBI painstakingly cataloged and preserved the bills, about $3,000 was returned to the Ingram family. In 2008, Brian, then an adult, auctioned off 15 of the Cooper bills for a total of $37,000 to collectors, ironically netting far more in value than their $300 face value. The remaining recovered Cooper bills, some still stuck together, became highly sought-after artifacts of the only unsolved skyjacking in US history. For the FBI, the Tina Bar find breathed new life into the Cooper case in 1980. They began recanvassing the entire area, searching up and down the Columbia shoreline for any other evidence, perhaps a parachute shroud, Cooper's briefcase, or even human remains. Nothing else was recovered, but the discovery proved that at least part of the ransom made it out of the plane and into the wild. It deepened the mystery. It answered one question. Yes, the money did go into the wilderness with Cooper, but raised many more about Cooper's fate and the chain of events that led to those particular bundles at that beach. The discovery of this money also solidified Cooper's legend in popular culture. The story was again splashed in newspapers nationwide. After years of nothing, here was a clue literally unearthed by a child. It rekindled the public fascination and inspired the first feature film about the case. In 1981, Hollywood released The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, a fictionalized adventure film starring Treat Williams as an ex-soldier who survives the jump and is chased by an insurance investigator played by Robert Duvall. Though loosely based on speculation, the movie reflected the enduring desire to imagine an answer to Cooper's fate, usually one in which he survives to enjoy his spoils, even if reality suggested otherwise. By 1981, though, with no new evidence following the discovery of this cache, the FBI again found the trail turning cold. The ransom bills from Brian Ingram's find were exhaustively tested. For example, the Bureau checked them for pollen or unusual chemicals. But nothing useful was gleaned beyond the known sand and algae. No fingerprints were recoverable from the degraded notes. Dan Cooper, if he was still alive, never attempted to spend the remaining $194,000. None of those serial numbers ever surfaced in circulation or bank deposits nationwide. As the 1980s progressed, the Norjack case transitioned into a monitoring status. Agents would still check out the occasional tip, but the full-court press of the 1970s was largely over. Time was not on the investigator's side. Witness memories were fading, physical evidence, like the cigarette butts and hair, had been lost or spoiled. And if Cooper was still alive, he was aging into his 50s or 60s, possibly already dead from natural causes. Yet the saga of D.B. Cooper was far from forgotten. If anything, it was metastasizing into a modern legend, and a bunch of amateur sleuths and aspiring codebreakers were taking up the cause, determined to solve the case even as official efforts waned. More after the break. Even after the FBI's initial investigation slowed, the mystery of D.B. Cooper continued to attract independent investigators and ignite periodic bursts of activity with each tantalizing new clue. Throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, a sleuthing subculture grew around the Cooper case. Authors, journalists, retired lawmen, and enthusiastic amateurs who pored over the FBI files, hunted for physical evidence in the Pacific Northwest, and chased down suspects on their own. One such sleuth was Thomas Kay, a paleontologist turned detective who in the late 2000s led a team called the Citizen Sleuths examining the Cooper case with modern technology. In 2007, the FBI, perhaps recognizing fresh eyes might help, released some previously secret evidence for outside analysis, including Cooper's clip-on tie. Kay's team put the tie under an electron microscope and found curious particles lodged in the fabric. Titanium and rare earth metals like pure cerium and strontium sulfide. These substances were extremely uncommon in 1971, found mainly in certain high-tech or lab settings, for instance at aerospace manufacturing facilities or research labs. This led to speculation that Cooper might have been an engineer or technician in the aviation or chemicals industry, perhaps even at Boeing or a contractor, since Seattle was a hub for Boeing and other cutting-edge metallurgy. One theory posited by researcher Eric Eulis was that Cooper's job might have involved working with titanium alloys at a company like Remcrew Titanium or Technotronics, both of which operated in the Portland area. The tie analysis did not prove anyone's identity, but it did add an intriguing piece to Cooper's profile. He might not have been a typical outdoorsman or rogue, but rather someone with a technical background who wore ties to work and had exposure to exotic materials. Another scientific approach was taken with the diorama-like evidence on the ransom money. In 2009, geological experts studied diatoms, fossilized algae on the Tina-Bar bills, and concluded that the type and life cycle of the diatom suggested the money was deposited in the river months after the hijacking, likely in spring or early summer 1972, when a certain group of species bloomed. This reinforced the idea that the money did not simply fall into the water immediately following the parachute jump, but may have moved later by flood or human intervention. However, absent a time machine, these findings remained circumstantial and open to interpretation. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the FBI continued to receive occasional tips and leads. Every so often, the media would report that the Bureau was testing a DNA sample from the tie against a new suspect's DNA, or checking a newly surfaced piece of evidence like a rotting parachute. For example, in 2008, the same year that citizen sleuths were analyzing the tie, children digging in a field near Amboy, Washington, not far from the suspected drop zone, unearthed a tangled piece of silk parachute fabric. Excitement surged that Cooper's parachute may have been found. The FBI consulted Earl Cossey, the same parachute provider from 1971, to identify it. It turned out to be a World War II-era pilot emergency chute, not related to Dan Cooper at all, likely left from a military crash decades earlier. This false alarm did, however, remind everyone that surviving a jump in that area was feasible. The parachute belonged to Marine Lieutenant Floyd Walling, who bailed out of his fighter plane in a storm in 1945 over the same patch of woods and survived an 8-mile trek to safety. Cooper's jump profile was eerily similar. Perhaps he too could have lived through it. The FBI's official position throughout all of these years remained cautious. They never found conclusive proof of Cooper's fate. Internally, many agents sided with Ralph Himmelsbach in his view that Cooper likely died, but they could not close the case on a hunch. Technically, if Cooper was still alive, he was a wanted fugitive guilty of air piracy and extortion, crimes that, under US law, do not have a statute of limitations. The FBI had actually filed an indictment against John Doe, aka Dan Cooper, in absentia to ensure this. In 2011, on the 40th anniversary of the hijacking, the Bureau made a surprising announcement. They were looking into a promising lead based on new information from a retired law enforcement source. The lead related to a man named Lynn Doyle Cooper, or L.D. Cooper. A woman named Marla Cooper had come forward telling a fascinating family tale. She claimed that as an 8-year-old in 1971, she heard her two uncles, L.D. Cooper and another uncle, plotting something suspicious over Thanksgiving. Her uncle L.D., she said, came home to their house in Sisters, Oregon the day after the hijacking, quote, bruised and bloody, unquote, claiming that he had been in a car accident. According to Marla, the family quietly suspected for years that LD had been the skyjacker. He was a war veteran, fitting the FBI's profile, loved the Dan Cooper comic books, and had outdoors experience as a logger. He also lived in the Pacific Northwest and was familiar with the area where the jump occurred. The clincher, one of Marla's uncles, she suspected was an accomplice, worked as an engineer at Boeing. Marla even provided the FBI with an old guitar strap of LD Cooper's to test for fingerprints or DNA. The Bureau tested what it could, but the strap did not yield usable fingerprints. They did find that a partial DNA profile lifted from the tie a few years earlier did not match one of LD Cooper's surviving relatives, but this was far from conclusive. The tie DNA might not have even been the hijackers, and could have come from a Boeing employee or flight attendant who handled it. An FBI special agent, Fred Gutt, said in 2011 that LD Cooper was not being ruled out as a suspect. The story made headlines. After all, there was a new suspect after decades. But ultimately, tangible proof was lacking. LD Cooper had died in 1999, so he could not be interrogated. And some investigators noted that LD had no parachute training, which either made him an odd fit or a gutsy novice if he were the culprit. In any case, by 2013, the FBI quietly let the LD Cooper lead drop off the radar, neither indicting him posthumously nor clearing him outright. The early 2010s saw a few more suspect flurries. A private investigator named Skip Porteous and a filmmaker, Nora Ephron, were involved in bringing to light the story of Kenneth Peter Christensen, a former Northwest Orient flight purser who had been quietly suspected by his own brother. Kenneth Christensen had been a paratrooper and was stationed in the Pacific, had worked for the airline, which meant he had known aircraft like the 727, and allegedly made a bit of a deathbed confession to his brother, Lyle, telling him, "There's something you should know, but I cannot tell you." Lyle Christensen later saw a Dan Cooper composite on a TV show and felt it was the spitting image of his brother Kenneth. In 2010, New York Magazine ran a story on Christensen as a suspect. They even got Florence Schaffner to look at Kenneth Christensen's photo. She commented that the man's ears and lips and forehead looked quite similar to Dan Cooper's, though she could not be sure after so many years. The FBI checked out Christensen and officially stated he did not fit. They believed he was too short, too light, and had lighter eyes than described. Retired FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach told New York Magazine that Kenneth Christensen was a poor match physically. Christensen had died in 1994. After his death, his family reportedly found gold coins and extra cash in his possession, but nothing like the ransom. Despite some intriguing coincidences, the FBI did not find any more direct incriminating evidence tying him to the hijacking. Another modern suspect who drew some considerable attention was Robert Rackstraw, a former U.S. Army helicopter pilot and ex-con. In 2016 through 18, an amateur team led by TV producer Tom Colbert heavily pushed Rackstraw as the real Dan Cooper. Rackstraw had a colorful military background with demolition and parachute training, was in his late 20s in 1971, though that made him younger than eyewitness accounts of Dan Cooper, and had a checkered post-military career involving fake identities and various legal troubles. Colbert's team went as far as trying to decode alleged hidden messages in some letters sent by A. D.B. Cooper to newspapers in the months after the hijacking, claiming that those codes spelled out Rackstraw's name. It made for dramatic television in a 2016 History Channel documentary titled D.B. Cooper Case Closed. But when journalists asked Rackstraw, then in his 70s, if he was Cooper, he slyly said no, but seemed to enjoy the attention. His attorney quipped, "He's not D.B. Cooper. Everything I've heard is that D.B. Cooper died, and Rackstraw is alive." The FBI had actually investigated Robert Rackstraw back in the late 1970s for a time, but dropped him from consideration in 1979 due to a lack of any direct evidence. In the end, Rackstraw passed away in 2019, and while Colbert's group remains convinced, the FBI never endorsed their theory. Another suspect surfaced in 2018, Walter Recca, proposed by his best friend, a man named Carl Lauren. Lauren released audio recordings he claimed were of Recca confessing in detail to the Cooper hijacking before his death in 2014. The recordings and an accompanying book, D.B. Cooper and Me, asserted that Walter Recca, a former military paratrooper, not only survived the jump, but actually encountered a dump truck driver on a road that night whom he asked for a lift. Carl Lauren says that Walter Recca told him he landed near Cle Elum, Washington, far east of the search zone, and eventually spent the ransom on a house, a car, and other assets, stashing some in a Canadian safe deposit box. This sensational story made news, but skeptics pointed out inconsistencies. The FBI responded with a polite statement that since they had closed the case in 2016, they would not comment on specific new tips or suspects, noting that no credible evidence had emerged that fundamentally changed their conclusions. Indeed, to that end, on July 12, 2016, the FBI officially announced that the active investigation was being suspended. In a press release, the Bureau said that it was reallocating resources to more urgent priorities after 45 years of fruitless pursuit. They summarized the case highlights and acknowledged its iconic status, but essentially declared that unless someone came forward with Cooper's identity or the remaining money, Norjack would remain unsolved. An FBI spokesperson stated that while tips would still be recorded, none to date have resulted in a definitive identification of the hijacker, and that although new information has at times produced plausible theories, none has yielded the necessary proof of culpability beyond a reasonable doubt. In the absence of that proof, the statement said, continuing to devote investigative resources was no longer justified. Effectively, the D.B. Cooper case was being filed away in the inactive archives, a rare admission of defeat on an infamous crime. But the FBI's closure did not dissuade the legion of Cooper sleuths. If anything, it galvanized them. Today, online forums and annual Cooper conventions keep the quest alive, dissecting every known fact and rumor. But officially, the case of D.B. Cooper is considered unsolved and suspended. Short of someone uncovering Dan Cooper's remains or a deathbed confession with rock-solid proof, it's likely to remain a fascinating historical whodunit. It has now been over half a century since the night of November 24th, 1971, and the legend of D.B. Cooper or Dan Cooper looms larger than ever. A mix of folklore, pop culture phenomenon, and a symbol of one of aviation's great unsolved crimes. The Cooper hijacking retains the distinction of being the only unsolved airline hijacking in American history. Every other domestic hijacker who demanded ransom or diversion was eventually caught or identified, except for the man calling himself Dan Cooper. The FBI's decision to close their active investigation in 2016 seemed to acknowledge that the case will never be definitively solved. However, closed is relative. The FBI still holds all of the evidence, and if tomorrow someone found a skeleton in the woods with a parachute and $194,000 in cash, you can bet that the Bureau would test every fiber of it. In interviews, agents have said that they would gladly reopen the case for some bona fide new information, but barring that, Norjack is in limbo. The case files, decades of reports, analyses, and tips stand as both a monument to an exhaustive effort and a reminder of a rare defeat for federal law enforcement. Despite the fact that he allegedly endangered dozens of lives and committed a serious crime, Dan or D.B. Cooper has been embraced in popular lore as a sort of modern-day outlaw folk hero. Particularly in the Pacific Northwest, the Cooper story carries a mystique akin to Legends of the Wild West. He's seen as the slick everyman who beat the system, sticking it to the big airlines and the feds, hurting no one except maybe himself in the process. Over the years, this mythos has only grown. There have been numerous songs written about him, country tunes like the Ballad of D.B. Cooper, as well as many books and at least 2 feature films. More recently, Dan Cooper got a tongue-in-cheek nod in the TV series Loki, which imagined the hijacking was a prank by the Norse god of mischief. He's been referenced in countless other shows, everything from Prison Break to news radio, and remains a fixture in true crime media, including documentaries and dramatizations. Cooper's legend is very much alive in the Pacific Northwest. For many years, the tiny town of Ariel, Washington, near Lake Merwin, close to the presumed drop zone, hosted an annual D.B. Cooper Days celebration on the weekend after Thanksgiving, timing that commemorated the hijacking's anniversary. The Ariel Store and Tavern was the focal point for Cooper fans, hosting look-alike contests, with people dressing in black suits and clip-on ties, some even jumping off small heights with parachutes. Screenings of documentaries and talks by authors and investigators. People would raise glasses of bourbon and 7-Up to toast the Mystery Man. Though the original tavern owners retired and the event became sporadic, the spirit persists. Even well into the 2010s, you could find gatherings of Cooper aficionados swapping theories over beers each November in Southwest Washington. Cooper's legacy, though, is not all celebratory. As I touched on earlier, he prompted real changes in aviation practices. We mentioned the installation of the Cooper vane on 727s and similar aircraft, effectively a mechanical lock on aft stairs during flights. This simple device prevented copycats from attempting the same escape method. Additionally, this heist, occurring amid a glut of skyjackings, hastened the adoption of strict pre-boarding screenings of passengers. By January 1973, a little over a year after the Cooper hijacking, the FAA, under pressure from a frustrated public tired of skyjackings, required all passengers to pass through metal detectors or physical screenings. So in a sense, Dan Cooper was one of the catalysts that ended the golden age of skyjacking. After 1972, the frequency of hijackings in US airspace plummeted. Air piracy for ransom largely died out as a phenomenon, only for terrorism to become the new threat in later decades. So one could argue that D.B. Cooper's infamous act inadvertently made the skies safer by forcing security improvements. As the FBI stepped back, the Cooper case became the playground of citizen detectives. It's a case that invited amateur involvement because so many pieces of evidence and leads are publicly accessible, yet it lacks a resolution. This is similar to some other famous unsolved cases, such as the Zodiac Killer. But D.B. Cooper's is unique in that it was a one-time event with a contained set of clues. The puzzle-like nature, matching suspects to the composite, analyzing weather data, digging for buried money, seems to attract people with a treasure hunt or puzzle-solving mindset. There are websites like DropZone and the D.B. Cooper Forum, where discussions dissect every detail, from the type of clip-on tie that he wore, purchased at JCPenney in the 1960s, to the specific serial numbers of the found money and the manufacturing dates of the parachutes. Some independent sleuths have even filed FOIA requests to get FBI files, or have managed to get old evidence, like the 1972 letters allegedly from Cooper, released for examination. These community-driven efforts have yielded intriguing tidbits, like discovering that one of the post-hijacking letters contained a numerical code, which, when decoded using a simple cipher, referenced coordinates in the northwest, though who sent the letter remains unknown. All the theories aside, the figure of Dan or D.B. Cooper stands as a testament to the power of an unsolved mystery. He is both a real criminal and a folk character now, occupying that hazy space between history and legend. The final verdict of D.B. Cooper is likely one that the public itself renders. The case is unsolved, but it is not due to a lack of trying or fascination. The case remains a fixture in the American consciousness because it combines elements so rarely seen together: mystery, daring, crime, adventure, and a complete absence of closure. It has invited each generation to project onto it their own imagination. Maybe he got away with it and is sipping Mai Tais on a beach under an assumed name. Maybe he died cold and alone in the woods, a broken body that eventually became one with the earth. Maybe he was someone we would never suspect, who went back to an ordinary life, carrying a monumental secret to his grave. As of today, the fate of Dan or D.B. Cooper is still open to interpretation. The FBI has put its files on the shelf, concluding that the case is closed. It's a mystery forever and always. Cooper's case endures as a challenge, an enduring cold case caper that invites anyone to try their hand at solving it. And until the day comes that definitive evidence surfaces, if it ever does, we're left with the story, the myth, and the tantalizing question: who was Dan Cooper, and did he beat the odds? Until that question is answered, the story of Dan Cooper or D.B. Cooper will remain unresolved. Hey, thank you all for listening. This has been the 300th episode of the podcast, and I wanted to do something a little special. This episode is a bit longer than our usual episodes, but yeah, it was kind of a beast to record, so I'm gonna stop talking now. Anyhow, thank you all for listening to 300 episodes of the show. It really means a lot. I appreciate each and every one of you. I'm gonna go now, probably go drink some water, but take care, stay healthy, talk to you later.